As musicians, is there anything special about the music of Schumann that makes it more difficult to play or more interesting to play? Or
sometimes he can be repetitive, like he'll hang on to an idea. For example, in the finale of the symphonic etudes, you know, the finale, and he keeps repeating that theme over and over again.
But why does he do that? Is there a sort of an obsessive quality to Schumann's music? It seems to me that undeniably Schumann thought very deeply about the form of his music. There always seems to be something going on inside the music that you somehow need the code for.
Well, there's a lot of codes, there's a lot of secrets.
Tell us about that, yeah.
Well, he was very interested in letter symbolism, where a written letter translates into a musical letter, and he played with that a lot. And
the Abegg variations.
Abegg variations, exactly. He was very, very literary. He was incredibly well read, and I think the written word informs a lot of his music.
Actually, that became obsessive when he went mad. There are a few letters which describe him seeing letters and seeing codes written between the words and between lines and in music as well.
And hearing them as musical notation.
Absolutely. Yes. They haunted him, I think, towards the end,
yeah. And then you hear Clara Schumann's music, and it's...
Tell us about that. What's it like to play the concerto of Clara Schumann? I mean,
she has that deadly passage on page 2. It killed me today. It did. It's so hard. It's quiet and it's so intricate. It's very Chopin-esque, actually, her compositional style, don't you agree?
Was she very influenced by Chopin as a composer?
I think so. And of course, Robert. But I hear a lot of Chopin, especially the passage work and the colors and the harmonies.
But how good do we think Clara really was? Do we think she was
as a
real
composer?
Yeah. Do we think she was a real major voice, or is it just an interesting footnote to her amazing story? Because the whole story of her life, she's an extraordinary woman, whichever way you slice it.
Well, she was extraordinary in 3 ways. She was extraordinary because she was the great concert pianist of her day, or one of them. I mean, certainly one of the 3 best of the period. And she was married to one of the greatest composers of the day. And she wrote her own music.
And she had 8 children.
And she had 8 children.
Who did the washing up?
But I suppose the question is, would she have had any currency as a composer if she hadn't either have been Robert Schumann's wife or been a great concert pianist? And I suppose the answer to that would probably be no.
Well, I don't know. I think she was melodically incredibly gifted. I think also for the rest of the piano trio, there are some really beautiful melodies in each of the movements.
I mean, that melody that you play on the cello, which is
glorious.
the second half of the piano concerto slow movement, is absolutely wonderful.
Glorious. I mean, it doesn't have the neuroticism that Robert has. It doesn't have this sort of inner tension, which is so compelling, I think, to play and to listen to.
Yeah.
And I always feel when playing Robert Schumann's music that you have to search for colours that you've never looked for before, in a way. You're constantly searching for something beyond what you can do. And I think Clara is much more placid in that way. She's much more human. She's much more approachable.
But then I look at a song like Er ist gekommen, and it's actually very Schumann-esque in that style. It's very tense and it's very neurotic, I think.
Does he write well for the violin, Schumann?
You know, actually, I think that it's often uncomfortable to play, violinistically speaking, I mean. But for me, the Robert Schumann music is quite complicated, because many times I feel that this music is closed inside, probably inside of his soul. And especially in this trio we play in the final, it's very difficult for us, I mean for all musicians, I think, to try to open these stems that we have, everybody. We have in the middle, you know, and that's all very often there is in the middle and never comes really open. And so this is it's quite complicated to realize, and so
because you never sing way up high, do you?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's confused sometimes, and especially in a trio that I consider very difficult to play, to have all the balances of rhythm and all this, you know, dialogue between us in this trio, and it's very difficult to understand where really you have to play and where not, where you have to be there in the middle. You know, it's quite complicated process.
So it's great chamber music then. I mean, in that you can't, you have to really listen to each other to be able to play well yourself.
But John, I think there's more than that, because I think a lot of the thing about Schumann is there's a lot of stuff between the notes. I mean, of all the great romantic composers, I think if you play him absolutely straight on the page, he's the one that comes to life least. I think he demands a lot of intervention from the performers. He doesn't write in absolutely everything that you need to bring it to life. You have to be a bit hands-on.
Yeah, you have to
in a way you don't with Brahms, I don't think.
Well, I was just thinking about the comparison between Brahms and Schumann, and I always think that Schumann tried to realise a lot on the piano in his mind when he was composing, and that includes this crazy idea to stretch his hand as far as he could out. I mean,
he
Brahms
broke his hand, didn't he?
Exactly.
Because he was trying to. He had a machine which stretched them.
Which actually Clara Wieck's father introduced.
Did he?
That's where.
Blimey.
He's
Clara
responsible for a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Clara did it too. Clara did the machine too, and she didn't break her hand. Yeah, that was her father's method of working her technique and giving her a bigger stretch and everything. Because, you know, in piano music, like when you play Chopin's music, it requires like an enormous stretch. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have a big hand, if you don't have a big stretch, you're kind of...
But for me, it also expresses what must have been going on inside, because he was constantly yearning to get more, and he wanted his hand to stretch even further, and every day kind of winding this screw one measure more and finally breaking his hand. But yeah, I think, as we were saying, Brahms is symphonic. I think when he sits at the piano, he imagined an orchestra in his mind. And with Schumann, even when he's writing for three or four, there's exactly, it's pianistic, and it's even further in his imagination.
But I wonder if the moment that he destroyed his hand and couldn't be a great pianist anymore was something of a relief to him. He didn't need to compete with Clara anymore. And he could just write for instrumentalists and not have to worry about playing it all himself.
Do you think he competed with Clara?
Well, I think in a sense they may have done when he was younger, that she was, because he lived in the home of a great piano teacher. Yes, of course he had a crush on her, but he was very ambitious. He had the energy to be everything. But from all the accounts of Clara as a young pianist, she was unsurpassable in her interpretation of things as well as her technique.
I think that Schumann is one of the most difficult composers to come to terms with and to understand, as you were saying, because the phrasing is so complex and the ideas can be really complex. And in this way, he's the perfect composer to put in this setting, together with words and explanation, because it helps me, and therefore it must help the audience to look on another level.
Well, and people love stories. I mean, I think anything involving storytelling is a great way.
And this is a very touching story.
It's a beautiful story, and also, to a great extent, the composers have used chamber music almost like diaries. If you look at the string quartets of Beethoven, it's like a diary. And Janáček did, and Smetana the same. And with the Schumanns, their songs and their chamber music is very diaristic in a way. You feel that you're with the music, you're looking into the pages of something deeply personal that you'll never quite get to the bottom of.
And I think it really evokes the atmosphere of 19th century music making, because this is very close to what happened. It's very salon atmosphere, soiree atmosphere. We sort of do. It's kind of like
for the leader, actually, but also for the trio.
Well, for the trio, very much so. And
I find it really electric, actually. I love to be in a theatre surrounding for once, where lights and atmosphere and words can really inspire and help. And I find that playing a piece of Robert or Clara after hearing their words, directly after hearing their words, gives such scope for new ideas in the phrasing, real imagination and inspiration.
It also puts you right there in the mood, in the vibe. Is that too American?
That word exists.
That word exists. It is not used very often. But it puts you in this sort of, you know, for example, the Traumerei, when we play it, I forget the last words before, but it's something.
She sits with us. She sits with him for a long time.
For a long time, and then you start that, and it just psychologically puts you in that state and frame of mind, and you imagine yourself there, and the music just flows through you, just like that.
And it's interesting you talk about Traumerei, because that's a piece that is from Kinderscenen, which is scenes from childhood, and they're very, very simple, short pieces, but they evoke memories of Schumann's childhood, but also his love for children.
Yeah.
And in many ways that also connected them, the two of them, Robert and Clara Schumann. They were both quite childlike in their way. I mean, both in their relationship to each other and in their relationship to music. They had the sort of wonderment of, that children have in discovering music for the first time. It is very poignant.
Yeah.
So, like all the great lieder composers, Schumann was, of course, a marvelous pianist and not a singer. So my question to you is, how much did he know about the voice?
Well, you can. And I actually don't sing very much Robert Schumann normally. I'm more on the Clara side, and I have to say that in recitals today, I tend to involve Clara Schumann more than Robert Schumann, and she writes exquisitely for the voice. You know, she's taken into consideration the range of every voice individually, but they particularly suit soprano and baritone, I think. For instance,
Simon?
I don't really know. There are some passages in that Keenlyside, some of those songs we're singing in this evening, which are simply impossible. The second song, as you know, the leap of about 2.5 octaves to imitate a young virgin praying to God is impossible, and yet you have to do it. So.
but it's no more difficult than Mozart. You know, when you think of all his octave leaps in all his various operatic arias and lieders over the years, I guess it's quite interesting that. They both make us work very hard.
You know, in the end, you're just telling a story, and it nothing to do with singing. You just got to speak, and then it's not vertical anymore.
So it feels like the songs are very emotional statements, as if they're not just the poetry of Ruckert or Kerner, but there's somehow it's an internal statement by Robert or by Clara. Do you feel that when you're singing? I mean, obviously you have to give it a lot of emotion.
I think I would use what you said. They're not songs. They're a mirror of a little aspect of the human condition. The fact that they're in German and that we wear tails makes them this holy art form, which they're not. They're just real life. And
the interesting thing is, for Robert's birthday often, Clara presented him with a song, and it was just an absolute outpouring of her love for him, and it's so obvious in the songs that she dedicated to him as a birthday gift or a Christmas gift.
Almost like writing a postcard. Or
almost, yes, or a love letter.
Yes, it's a love letter.
Yes.
Which is also why it's nice to be doing this in a more domestic milieu and not in some 2,000-seater concert hall. I'm interested in what Derek thinks in that, in terms of, you know, the letter or the...
Well, I'm here to learn.
Please.
I do think it's a marvellous combination of the spoken word and the sung word and the music, the combination of music and the actor's voice. I mean, it's your musical technique and your singing technique and my vocal technique. The combination, I think, is quite exciting. But as far as the Schumanns, I am, as I say, a learner. I'm learning from all of you. And just sitting there, and as the narrator, of course, I'm slightly outside it all. I just say who is who, where we are, at what stage in the development we happen to be. This happened. But the expertise is all you. I don't have to express emotion. I have to, obviously, deliver the text with a degree of sympathy and knowledge, but you are turning on sixpences and doing all this wonderful emotional stuff and thrilling the audience. There is nothing in what I do that thrills. There is nothing there to thrill.
Not today, darling.
I am just there to introduce you to thrill. And my goodness, you do. All of you. Amazing.
There's a danger in what you referred to turning the sixpence, because it's not a song cycle, because it's not a program that's been thought through just purely musically. The range, I think it would be a mistake to have too big a range of emotions in each single song. It's just too rich a diet. Yeah. You have to think of, you know, a little bit smaller range at times.
Yes.
Because most of the songs that you're singing were written as part of a cycle of songs, so that they are themselves telling a story, which is rather different from the story that we're telling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if not a story, they're part of a sort of patchwork quilt, which has been very carefully designed. Yeah. And we're taking out, we're snipping, if you want to continue the image, we're snipping, you know, out squares of that.
And we're also taking the songs out of context, in that we're giving them an emotional authority that they didn't have in quite the way that when they were first written. We're giving them a slightly different emotional authority,
do you think
because we're
Schumann,
juxtaposing.
do you think Schumann would be thrilled and delighted at your ingenuity, John, or do you think he'd be very cross? Do you think he's touching down from composer heaven?
I wouldn't like to say.
No, I think he liked publicity. I get the feeling that he was a publicity
I don't know
mad
that. No, I don't think he was. I think he was very shy and very tormented.
Well, there you are. You see, I've learnt something else.
And
I am here to learn.
And when Clara went and played on her tours, you know, he would be nursing his one drink in the corner at the soiree after. No, I think he was he was a disastrous conductor. He was a hopeless conductor because he couldn't do the public thing.
Was he ever
very private.
jealous of her?
I was just going to ask.
Well, I'm sure on some level he must have been.
Because, you know, her songs definitely stand up next to his. Even though she didn't write as many, obviously, but I think the ones that she did are they're masterpieces in their own right.
He in the terms of history, though,
Not all
he is
of
more
them.
famous, isn't he?
Yes.
I mean, to me,
As a
he's more
composer,
famous.
Yes.
yeah.
But she's also writing in his shadow. I mean, I don't think we should overstate the case for her. I mean, I think she's good, but I mean, she pinched quite a lot of good ideas from him, I think. You know, I mean, how could she not? And that's the thing, but I don't know. My personal jury is out in that one. I'm not completely convinced. But I'm just amazed. We were talking about this earlier. I'm just amazed that she had time to do any of this. If you think what Clara's daily life must have consisted of. Because somehow I don't think it was Robert rolling up his sleeves and doing the nappy changing. I mean, you know, 8 children. And I mean, if you just work out the amount of her life, her adult life for which she was pregnant alone and looking after this terrible depressive obsessive personality. I mean, what a life.
And at the same time learning,
of course, yeah,
learning the hardest pieces of Liszt, Brahms, Chopin.
And
but pianos were simpler then.
The notes were the
easier
same.
to play on.
The notes were the same. You still had to memorize
Yeah, but
them.
actually the keys were actually narrower.
Smaller. And people didn't have records of Marta Argerich playing it, so there was no one to compare it to.
Yeah, she could have been bad.
No TV.
But also, do think, though, of when they did tours, I mean, she went and played in St. Petersburg and Riga and all these places. I mean, doing that in a stagecoach.
And it took a long time.
Yes.
It took a long time, no practice pianos there, very cold when they get there. I mean, and pregnant, you know, not a bundle of laughs.
Dan, tell us about the relationship between Robert and Clara Schumann and Chopin and Mendelssohn and Brahms. And it was quite a crew, wasn't it, of people who knew each other well?
Yes, there was. And, I mean, Robert and Clara, as comes across in this production, were living for a time together with Friedrich Wieck. But in Leipzig at the time, there was a whole group of musicians, particularly that Robert was kind of hanging out with. He was a young man, he was into music, he was into art, he was into poetry very much, philosophy. So he had friends who were musicians, but also artists and poets.
Who were the greatest of those?
Well, I suppose, I mean, probably one of the most well-known of those is Mendelssohn.
And he was a close family friend of the Schumanns, Mendelssohn.
He was certainly a very close friend of Robert Schumann and Clara, yes. But in the 1830s as a whole, which is when Robert Schumann wrote most of his piano music and Clara wrote a lot of hers, there's musicians, the piano it's really at its peak in the century. And in Leipzig you have the group of musicians that are clustered around Robert Schumann, and in Paris you have all of the virtuosos. Then they're travelling around Europe over into London, into Berlin. We've talked about Petersburg and Riga and places like that, Prague. So they're sort of, as musicians at that time, really composing in that sort of climate where you've got lots and lots of pianists writing for the piano, lots of people composing, playing their own music, and so they're really in there and in amongst it. So to speak, of course, Robert Schumann can't perform. Clara can, so there's...
How did she rank in terms of pianistic glory? I mean, how did she rank with her peers of the period?
I think her peers certainly saw her as one of them. I know Liszt, for example, was very, very admiring of her ability as a pianist. Chopin too. particularly admired the way that she performed his music. And that was something that Robert, too, of his own music, said, you know, Clara is the only person who really knows how to perform this. So in terms of the 1830s as a whole, she ranks up against Liszt and Thalberg. And I mean, she really was pioneering as a pianist, very famous in her own lifetime. There's a wonderful piece about a poem by Grillparzer about her performing the Appassionata Sonata and somehow unlocking it in a way that he'd never heard it played before. Is that true, you think? Yes, and I think, I mean, she really innovated in the way that now we take for granted many of the things that happen in a piano recital, for example. The pianist will play from memory, and the pianist will play a whole host of works. That's certainly something that we expect. There are exceptions to that, obviously. Clara Schumann, or Clara Vickers, she was then was going out and programming music that wasn't her own. So one of the first people to program Robert Schumann's music, one of the first people to program Chopin's music, and to play the music of Beethoven, Bach, people like that. So she really brought that out to an audience. Because the other pianists were tending to play their own music, Chopin, Liszt, for instance, and Thalberg as well, and maybe sneak in a piece by somebody else very, very occasionally, but mostly concentrating on their own work. Most of them would concentrate on their own music, and obviously that was a way of promoting their music in the sort of public sphere. There were lots and lots of amateur pianists at the time, and publishers really, really clamoured for new publications. So it was one way for a pianist to certainly kind of get themselves known, was to go out onto the stage, perform all of their pieces, and then they'd be released into the it sounds public market. She was very generous in the sense that she spread her talent around a bit. But did she also have a feeling that she herself wasn't amongst the first rank of composers? Yeah, I think the composing is certainly an interesting issue, and I think it's definitely. She had doubts sometimes about her playing, particularly after she sort of split with her father, and she really believed that he was the only person who was picky enough to really make her work hard enough that she'd get out there. And she did have sort of crisis of confidence on several occasions just before concerts, and she'd kind of get ill and she'd have problems with her fingers and things, and some of that was probably psychosomatic. But she was much more assured, I think, in that sphere. The composing was, I think she felt at the time, and there was probably a feeling at that time in the 1830s, that composing wasn't really something that women had an ability to do. She was very, very good as a composer, but was she as good as her male counterparts? I think they didn't really know what to make of that, and obviously that translated into some sort of self-doubt. And I think when you go through the letters and when you read them, there's moments where she really, really does wonder if as a woman she has the ability to compose. Now, what's interesting about that is that Robert Schumann, obviously, he loved to compose, and there's a slight ambivalence as to his encouragement of her as a composer. He is critical at times, offers advice, but perhaps it was something that he didn't maybe support as much as he might have been a little jealous of her, in a way, in that she had such access to the limelight. I think one of the things that comes across from their careers is that they were very different, and obviously Robert Schumann injured his hand at a young age, and that really was the career that he saw himself pursuing as a pianist, becoming a virtuoso, travelling Europe, composing his music and putting it out there on the stage and playing it to an audience, and that really at that point had to end for him. So in a way we owe that hand injury rather a lot, in that he would surely have concentrated much more on pianistic music than he would on his symphonic or music or chamber music or his songs. I think at the time, I think that the hand injury certainly is a part of the way his career goes from that point onwards. I think he concentrated anyway, despite the injury, on piano music in the 1830s, but that wasn't really how he was known amongst his peers. He was known as a music critic. And that's really, at that point, when he got the hand injury in the early 1830s, at the same time he was very, very interested in poetry and in writing and in writing.
When you say
about
critic,
music.
you mean also sort of musicologist and theorist? And
Yes, I mean, he was very pioneering in what he achieved as a music critic, and his first piece of published music criticism was actually on the Opus 2 variations by Chopin of La Città La Mano from Don Giovanni.
He was an extraordinarily gregarious and generous man, wasn't he? Tell us about the Davidsbundler Tanz and all that. The Davidsbund.
The Davidsbund, yeah. They were this group of... Well, Schumann had this wonderful knack of kind of blending the real world with this fictional world, and he would give that group of people that were around him. The Davidsbund were a group of people that were around him geographically in real life. They were there in Leipzig with him. But
fellow musicians,
artists, music critics, poets. Friedrich Wieck was in there, and he gave them all sort of literary pseudonyms, as it were, and his
like
kind
Elgar
of
with his.
Very much so. But this was for Robert Schumann. It's interesting because it was there as a literary device in that it served a purpose in the way that he would write about music, because he could assume these characters, and when you read his music criticism at the time, it has these narratives that change voices. I mean, him himself, he was split into Florestan and Eusebius, so he'd write music and sign it with an F or an E, or he'd write music criticism, sign it with an F and an E, and it served a purpose there in a literary sense, in the way he was writing about music. But also, I think, at that time, he probably felt that when he injured his hand and had to stop being a pianist, and there's Clara and Chopin, who he absolutely loves at this time, who are out there performing as virtuosos, somehow he's excluded from that. And probably the writing was one way that he felt he could connect with this world that all of a sudden was cut off.
Pseudonyms he was inventing, especially for himself, was it a way of hiding behind these assumed characters a little bit and not coming quite out into the open before he was mature enough to feel confident?
Perhaps. I mean, I think that something that comes across in reading the letters and reading about his life is that he was fairly introverted, and so you get reports of other people being in a room and they say, I was wherever it was, and Robert Schumann, the music critic, was there, and he didn't say much, or he sort of hung in the background. And perhaps he wasn't known, so he would go with Clara on tours when she was playing, and he'd be introduced as the wife, or the husband. He'd be introduced as the husband of Clara Wieck, the
which he hated,
Clara Schumann, the pianist. Yeah, I mean, it was very difficult for him too. I think what sort of gets forgotten now is because Robert Schumann became what he became sort of after his life, in the way that he's been pushed forward as someone who was wrote this great music, that we forget that at the time, and especially in the 1830s, Clara is the one who's really known in Europe.
Yes.
And he really is not having much luck as a pianist. Yeah. His music doesn't get published. Clara will perform it, but then will also say to him, look, I can't play your music because these people aren't going to understand it. I can't put it out on a programme and play it to hundreds of people because they just won't know what to make of it. They were turning up to see, pianistic fireworks, basically, which was what they wanted, and that Robert Schumann's music wasn't really like that. No.
Tell us about the madness. Because that's obviously very complex. Nobody quite knows precisely what was wrong with him, and people have talked about syphilis, people talk about congenital mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders. But can you put your finger on what was the matter?
I don't think it's probably something that I can put my finger on. I don't know that we really do know. The symptoms that he displayed have been sort of attributed to various things that it could have been. I know that syphilis is probably one of those that's kind of been pushed forward, that was there and then developed later in life.
But it's interesting that most of Robert and Clara's male children died early or went mad in a similar way to Robert, and all the daughters were unaffected by it, which would suggest more of a congenital disorder.
Yes, yeah, perhaps it was, and I mean and on top of that, anyway, he was probably someone who, and whether this was to do with the illness or with just his general character, he was a fairly introverted person. He went through terrible bouts of depression, and in his younger life, whether that was to do purely with some kind of disease that he obviously had some
but
kind of mental
he talks very
disease.
early on in his letters to Clara about the terrible fear that haunts him, that he might go mad.
Yes, and I think it's something that certainly is a feature all the way through his life. I think that the danger is that we read into his music this kind of madness, and I'm not sure that it's always there. He was a very, very creative musician
and in
and
many
composer.
ways his music was incredibly sane and intellectual.
Yes.
There was always a profound intellectual basis for everything that he wrote.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. I think one of the things that is probably worth talking about that perhaps doesn't come through so much in all of the music that we've listened to today is that there was a great amount of musical exchange going on between Robert and Clara Schumann, especially in the early 1830s when they're both composing for the piano. They're both being taught by Friedrich Wieck, and their piano music at that time, there's lots of it where you'll sit down to play a piece of music by Robert Schumann, and lo and behold, you'll find yourself playing some.
It turns into a piece by Clara.
It will have
and
music by
again.
Clara Wieck in it.
That's
so, for example, in this performance, there was talk about how he gave her the Opus 11 F-sharp minor piano sonata, and that she loved it and she'd play it so often, and sort of maintaining her in this time when they're apart. Well, the second movement of that begins with some of her music. Robert borrowed something from her.
As a homage to her?
I think he was doing it as a way of sending messages, and I think this is something that as the decade of the 1830s goes on and they've been separated by Friedrich Wieck, who's put his foot down and said, no, you're not going to get married. I think this, because there was no way of really seeing each other in any physical sense, they communicated through these letters, but the other way that they could do it was through music. And that obviously started off in 1833 with the joint performance of the Adagio from the Chopin variations, which isn't as arbitrary. It wasn't an arbitrary choice. As with everything with Schumann, anything that he does for a reason, and he chose the Chopin for a particular reason. The Adagio he absolutely loved. The piece was a piece that he wrote his first piece of criticism on. And when he writes that, he says there's a moment in the Adagio where you get the section where it starts off in a very kind of fierce way, and it's quite moody and dark. And then as it goes on, you get this wonderful, lyrical, very Chopinesque kind of operatic Bellini type melody that comes through in a section in G-flat major. And in his criticism of this, Schumann says that's the moment probably of the first kiss. And so this is why he picks it. And I'm sure Clara would have known this, and she would have, and that's why they sit down together and they're playing this music. And although they're
playing the music in miles apart from each other, and the music is meeting in the middle of the city.
And this is what Schumann was trying to, and Clara were trying to construct in the piano music at the time, where he would say to her, look, I've just written these pieces, here they are, and she'd sit down and play them, and she'd hear something or feel something very familiar. And that's the other thing, this is something that's very sort of tactile on the keyboard. She can feel her own pieces in amongst Robert's music. They were great musicians, but also they were just two young people who fell in love and were kept apart. And it's a great story about how you can keep that going. And there are times when they're really struggling. You know, they don't see each other for 18 months in the middle of the 1830s, and that's just unimaginable for us nowadays. When you can send an email.
They'd be texting each other.
Exactly, and it's instantaneous. You can fly. It's much easier, and to go for that long and not really, when her father is absolutely adamant that they're not going to get married. And she, who has grown up really under the shadow of the father, who's been very controlling about what she's going to do with her career, and obviously absolutely loves him. And it's very, very difficult. And I know Robert had terrible doubt about whether he was doing the right thing. And it's just, so it's a wonderful story. On top of that, you get this wonderful music that they're both writing at the time. And in a way, these points when you're playing and you perceive these affinities in the piano music, it's at those moments where these historical things become tangible. And we bridge another kind of distance. It's the distance from the present to the past.
How does it feel to get inside the skin of these people?
It's pretty intimate.
It is? In what way?
But hearing their music at the same time as telling their rather tragic story is very engaging and very emotional. And it's at some points in this production, it's very hard not to get too carried away with it. Yeah. It's very emotional, particularly with the music. So we've learned a great deal about them on that level. And I think it's a great in for people who perhaps don't normally listen to classical music. You know, people think it's very abstract and distant, but if there's a story attached to it, especially a story like this one, it brings people in and makes more sense of the music to people who don't normally listen. Yes. So I think it's a good project. Yes.
Trudie, what does it feel like to be Clara Schumann? I mean, can you relate to her?
Well, I don't know whether I relate to her. I'm not aware that I'm me at all. But it's agonising a lot of the time and sort of unbearable and very...
because of losing the way she lost Robert to madness and.
Well, like Sting says, it's incredibly intimate, and you know we're a couple who've been together for quite some time, and so the idea of me losing my husband is, and I'm confronted by that when I look at Robert Sting. It's very, very painful is the way to describe it, and so I'm not really. I'm never very technical in this role. It's very full-on emotional experience for me. Yes. But I love the opportunity and the challenge to play her from being a teenager when she started to compose and being this wunderkind who was sort of on the concert tour of Germany, and he was very much sort of besotted with her, and I love the description of her being she dominated everyone around, a proper little bossy.
But she was like a spoilt little kid as well. She obviously had her father wrapped around her little finger, which is why he loved it there, you know, he couldn't forgive her for not continuing to be the best man in her life.
And then she sort of grows up on stage, doesn't she? We see her then, the relationship with the father, as you said, who was very tough on her, and this slightly terrible moment when she says he can't be affectionate with me anymore. He turns cold at the thought that my heart could be beating for another man. I mean, it's very coyly said, but she's like she's expressing some kind of fear of incestuous relationship.
There's a Freudian level there.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that at the moment when Clara knows she has to break away from her father, she almost elects Robert to replace him as both lover and father figure. That Robert becomes father, lover, husband, all at the same time. Maybe that was a role that he found tough, to do all those things and be a composer at the same time. It was tough for somebody of his delicate mental constitution.
Yes, and I think he I think, though, that it's worth saying that she was a very independent woman. She was, I mean, for her time, she was quite unusual in that she was following the career that she was. And, of course, as soon as Friedrich Wieck was out of the picture, her father, she was then having to do all of the things that he was having to do herself. So things like organising a venue, tickets, making sure that people are going to show up, that the press are there, and so in a sense, although he was very, very controlling over her career when she was young, I mean, he gave her wonderful training, and that she was then able to go on and take control of this part of her life herself. I know it was probably a real strain on her, and I think you're right. Robert probably wasn't, because he hadn't grown up and done that himself, wasn't maybe always in the best position to offer her advice, although she did used to turn to him for advice on things like what should I play in my recitals and things. So I think there definitely was a partnership between them there.
one of the most touching things in their letters to each other, which we include in this programme, is when Clara is in Vienna and she goes to the graves of Beethoven and Schubert, and it's almost as if she's visiting, on Robert and her own behalf, visiting the graves of some personal friends who they miss very much. They didn't actually know Beethoven and Schubert, did they, personally?
No, they didn't. And but
the sense of fraternity.
Yes, there was, and really for Schumann especially, I mean, it really comes across in the things that he writes at the time for his music journal and the criticism, and there's some references to both Beethoven and Schubert in his letters as well. I mean, these were two very, very important figures for him as a German.
Because they were undeniably great figures.
I mean,
even then it was clear that they were absolutely towering geniuses.
Yes, and they were really, that was a legacy that was passed on down to Schumann, and he had to really sort of grapple with that as an artist. And I don't know, as any artist would, when you have some great sort of predecessor looming over you, and you're sort of wrestling with that space. And I think Robert Schumann really felt very aware of that as a German being born into that sort of tradition.
But it's interesting that Clara says she sends him a sprig of yarrow from Beethoven's grave, and then she talks about our Schubert, as if he was their personal property. I guess a lot of people feel like that about Schubert, that he's one of those people who can easily feel like a best friend.
I think, as we said before, when you play the music of a composer like that, you have a sort of psychic connection to them, a very intimate psychic connection, and so you will feel as if you know Schubert or Beethoven if you played their music.
And with the songs especially, that Robert wrote song cycles which were not imitative of Schubert, but absolutely, he couldn't have written those cycles if Schubert hadn't written his before.
And his piano music was inspired by Schubert. The Carnival Papillon, for example, inspired by these cycles of waltzes that Schubert would write. So, I mean, Schubert was a hugely influential figure on Robert Schumann, and as much as Beethoven was.
But you talk about one composer being influenced by another, Sting. I mean, you're a composer. You've been writing music all your life, and recently you did a CD of John Dowland, where you must have got very close to that troubadour composer. But here, you're performing only with words. You're acting, but you're not singing. You're not performing the music. Other people are doing that. How different is that?
Well, it's very good to be represented by people as talented as Simon Keenlyside, who does a very good job at singing the songs, and so it's wonderful.
I keep imagining you might just suddenly spring into song.
I would love, if I had the training in the technique, I'd love to. But Simon is an amazing performer.
But as a musician, as a composer yourself, can you relate to Robert and the pain of what he goes through? I mean, the difficulties that you get into when you go on a creative journey.
It's a personal journey, and it's one that you're forced to share, and sometimes you're sharing things that perhaps you wouldn't normally share unless you were an artist. I think that's the conundrum of being an artist. They're very private thoughts, and you make them public. That creates a tension.
Because there isn't anything fundamentally very different between a song cycle and an album, is there? It's 12 or 14 or 15 songs or whatever it is, and in some sense they relate to each other. As Iain Burnside was saying before, they're a patchwork of feeling. They tell a story in some way. I
was very affected by the Clara song, Er ska kommen in Storm and Regen.
Yeah.
What an unusual, angular, strange song.
Yeah.
It seems like it came from nowhere.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what its precedents were, but it just seems like it just stood out like a...
Yeah, it's violent, passionate.
Yeah, it's very violent.
I mean, it's my fancy perhaps that she wrote that after hearing him talking about standing out in the rain all night. I don't know whether that's true.
It'd be nice to...
But it has that sort of terrible, passionate sense of loss and grief that they can't be together, and that nothing's ever going to happen for them.
There's a great piece by Robert Schumann, the Fantasy in C, Opus 17, which he wrote in the first movement of in 1836, obviously at the time when Clara and Robert are not together. and he writes in a letter to Clara that he's written this new piece and that he says it's a profound or a deep lament for you. And in the fantasy he writes in some references to the Beethoven song cycle and Ferner geliebt, to the distant beloved, and really that's the piece was written for the Beethoven monument, which had been organised by Liszt at the time, and it's as much a monument to Beethoven as it is a very sort of private monument to his Clara. So he was, I'm sure, and he said, Robert Schumann said, that everything around him affects him, people, politics, everything in his life, and he really felt that came out in his music. So I'm sure that these moments, like in the Clara songs, that you would like to think, they seem to correspond with things that were going on.
But is that what it's like when you set out to write a new album? You sort of collect things from all around you.
Yeah, you collect fragments.
Emotional magpiedom.
And put them together. But, everything that's happening in the world is affecting the politics of the world, the ecology, your personal relationships, everything.
And other composers, other people
Absolutely.
who you love to
people you can
listen
steal
to
from, which is a very old idea.
An old and honourable tradition. Yeah.
I think this medium that we have on the stage of chamber music and the spoken word is incredibly powerful, and I had no idea when we started this exciting adventure just really how rich it would be as an experience for me. So I love that, and I think that she, I resonate with her in this sort of multitasking, sort of superwoman aspect that she...
When did she have time for it all?
Yeah, how did she have time to raise 8 children, and then when Robert dies, that she was the breadwinner, presumably,
sure.
and going
she
on...
was always the breadwinner, though, wasn't she?
Well, she earned more than he did, I dare say.
Really, in the day she did?
I mean, I think that she brought in a significant amount of the income. I mean, Robert really made most of his money out of the journal. So certainly not as a.
There wasn't much money in composing.
Not for him.
No.
What kind of money were they making as performers? Was it consummate with what we make?
No.
No. But they...
I don't know how much you make.
A lot, but
not as much as you.
They could live a comfortable life as...
They lived they lived a comfortable sort of middle class life. I mean, I would say that they were comfortable, but it was an issue to Robert. And I think towards the end of the 1830s, it really became something that he became very conscious of, the fact that he was going to be marrying someone and then having to support her. And his piano music wasn't doing very well. He wasn't selling much. It wasn't very popular. And at that point, he starts to really question where his career as a composer is going, and then he starts writing for other mediums other than the piano.
So, was his music considered difficult?
Yes,
it was.
It was considered difficult to understand. It wasn't, well, if you compare, there's a lot of music at that time being written for a very large amateur marketplace, and what they wanted were often variations on popular operas of the time. So, I mean, Chopin wrote those variations on the aria from Don Giovanni, which was a hugely popular opera at that time, and hundreds of other variation sets were written just on that opera, but you'd get the contemporary opera arias being rewritten. So Robert Schumann really didn't like that, and he was very, very critical of the pianists that were doing that, most of them centred in Paris, and that was one of the reasons why he set up the music journal, not just because he can't be a performer, but also because he wanted to do something about the fact that, as he saw it, music was in a terrible state. You had this great age of Beethoven, and then all of a sudden we've got this terrible stuff that's coming out on the piano. So his music really didn't aim to please an audience in that way, and it was very, very much a completely different, written for a completely different setting. It wasn't written to be performed in a huge concert hall. It's very intimate kind of music. He was very introverted, and that really comes through in lots of those pieces. So,
but it's interesting as well what you were saying about the celebrity. I mean, these days, rock stars such as yourself, you are the new aristocracy in some ways, you know. But in those days, well, there are successful musicians have a social currency now amongst everybody. You know, you're in the magazines all the time. It's fascinating to hear in the letters how Clara complains bitterly that she is supposed to be a great artist. And she goes to some castle or country house or whatever, and she performs. And as soon as she's performed, she gets a cup of water and a crappy little bedroom to sleep in. And it's a really lowly life, because actually she's socially below the pale. She's just a sort of performing seal. And it must have been incredibly demoralizing to have that sense that you were living high artistic ideals, and yet you were constantly socially demoted beneath the rank of even gentlemen.
So even though she was well known in her day, that she wouldn't have been paid well. And then what? Next question: what happened to her music, and why isn't it as popular as Robert Schumann's?
Those are interesting questions. She was probably paid less than she would have liked, or at the time Friedrich Wieck would have liked, and they complained often that they'd go to these concerts where they'd been promised a certain amount of money for her performance, and that when it came to the end of the evening, if they could track down the person that had organised the concert, they'd often say, well, actually, we don't have money to give you, but we'll give you these jewels. We'll give you this valuable necklace. Well, that's great. In terms of Clara's music and why it's not been performed as much, I think that's a bigger issue about women in music generally, and classical music, and why it has been that we have there's a situation where certain types of music has been excluded, and other kinds of music are the kinds of music that we know about. And that's a whole range of social, cultural, political kind of reasons. And obviously for Clara, one of those reasons was that she was a woman, and at the time it wasn't an expected career choice of a woman being a performer, let alone being a composer. And really, I mean, a lot of the piano music she writes in a very short period of time in the 1830s, and then there's a huge gap where she doesn't write at all for ages. It's not until much later that she returns to the piano. And I think a lot of that is because of this self-doubt that she had as a composer, probably because of the climate.
And when Robert dies, how much longer does she go on performing?
For years and years and years.
She's 74 when she died.
Yeah, she
doesn't stop, does
no.
she? She just kept going right the way.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Too ill to perform.
At what point did Robert become, or his compositions become popular? And was he as radical as, say, like Schoenberg was in his era?
I don't think he was radical in that sense, no. I think he enjoyed a certain amount of success in his lifetime for sure, but really it was towards the end of his life. And Brahms had a part to play in really promoting Robert Schumann as a great German composer, and that was done for a whole host of reasons, and there were lots of other things going on musically at the time. So that was really at the point at which Robert really starts to become known as a composer as much as a music journalist.
Would it be true to say that most of Clara's music was performed before she married and started to have children?
Yes, because she was probably the only person performing her music publicly. It was like I said earlier.
There was a big gap in the performance, in her writing things, and that happened after she married and started to have children.
Yes, it sort of comes towards the end of the 1830s, and it might have something to do with that, and I'm sure it does. But
I mean, I'm just wondering if her compositions might have been more of an expression of her yearning, her romanticism, her unhappiness, a way of expressing herself when she couldn't be with Robert. She couldn't, and that somehow that became less of an urgent need.
Well, I think a lot of the piano compositions are written really before all of that happens, or sort of the beginning of that part of her life, and so they're written when she's really being promoted as a travelling musician at the time, right. And that was just
and
one
she
thing.
Had to write.
Yeah, you went out and you performed your pieces. And
but I was wondering if once she was married and living with Robert, whether the insecurity you've talked about her feeling as a composer might have really come home to her, because there's he hacking it out every day and trying to, create extraordinary original works. And that might have made her feel a little difficult in relation to...
There was probably some conflict in her as to being the good wife to her husband, who was, trying very hard to be successful as a composer. And
trying to help him to make his works as successful as they could be.
And at the same time, she was this professional musician. She loved playing the piano. I mean, that's what she'd done pretty much all of her life. And to give that up entirely for him, I think, was something that she found very difficult. I think that comes across in the letters, for sure.
Do we know which composer that she played extremely well? I mean, I have a feeling Mozart was probably her favourite.
I'm not sure about Mozart. I would say that Robert Schumann thought that she played his music very, very well, and he absolutely loved her to play it and didn't think anyone else could play it as well as she could. It was thought that she played Chopin very, very well.
Some people said she played it better than Chopin did.
Than Chopin, yes. Yeah. Well, she was probably a little bit more...
technically more proficient.
Well, I was going to say that Chopin was... he didn't like performing in public, and he was prone to sort of bouts of illness and things. He was fairly weak and played very quietly and things. I'm sure he's an absolutely fantastic pianist. Yeah. But Clara was really at ease in a
really sell the music.
Yes, yeah.
And she played Liszt as well. So she played the hardest stuff there was to play.
Wow.
And Beethoven. There is that wonderful account of her playing the Passionata Sonata, and sort of unlocking that in a way that particular poet had thought it had never been unlocked before. It was remarkable.
I wanted to ask what, from your experience of the letters and performing them to each other, do you feel like you've gotten to know something about their characters or their relationship, the kind of relationship they had? What do you have a particular kind of sense of that? Who they were?
I think John's chosen the letters very, very well and carefully, and that it does give the arc of both their personal stories and their story of their relationship. So yes, I think we do understand it much more than we did in the beginning, and you get it through osmosis, through the music. You feel it. It's the emotion is there. So yeah, I think we're on the way to understanding. It's nice to talk to someone who clearly knows a great deal about it.
Do you have a sense of what they were like as parents?
I know that Robert absolutely doted on the children. He'd write little pieces for them, and I think the two of them probably loved them, but I really don't know, to be honest.
Because when I play her, I don't have the sense that, even though I'm sure that she had a duty to do, to feed and take care of her children, but she never refers to them. And we know, for instance, that her boys, if not all of them, perished in the same way that Robert did. I think they went insane, didn't they? Yeah. But she keeps expressing, and right at the end, when she's an old lady, I imagine in that last speech when she says that she's had a dream, and there she is in her white dress and a white veil, and there you were sitting silently by it, but she doesn't, and she says, so you're my everything. She doesn't mention the fact that, I've got my kids at least, in a stoic kind of way. Did you normally think of an old lady of 74? Well, he's gone, but I've got my kids and my grandchildren. She doesn't even mention them.
Yeah, her letters run out, of course. I mean, when Robert died, she stopped writing completely. So we don't have very, very little that she wrote. That letter about having the dream about being in a coffin is from much earlier, although we push it at the end of her life because it's so, the reference to death is so interesting there. But the thing about the children, it's a fascinating, unanswerable thing because they seem so obsessed with one another.
Yeah.
That the children must have had quite a tough job getting a look in emotional terms, even though they were obviously greatly loved. they weren't part of the extraordinary romance that they were, but had somehow both, they'd co-written about each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel that.